Free luxury getaway this weekend? My wife's eyes sparkled as she waved a glossy brochure. The pamphlet showcased a lavish new resort nestled on the Gulf Coast. Skepticism crept in as I imagined the price tag, but she explained that her agency was handling the resort's publicity, and we could attend for free, which would benefit our relationship. I was initially hesitant because of a soccer match that Saturday, but I reconsidered. Our 8-year marriage had been strained due to issues with my construction company and recent financial difficulties, including selling our house. With business finally improving, the event seemed like a welcome break. Felicia, a vice president at a top PR firm in Orlando, had been instrumental in keeping us afloat during the recession with her rising success and long hours. Her job often meant late nights, which had strained our marriage, reducing the intimacy we once had. We packed on Wednesday and left early Thursday for Weeki Wachee, driving to the resort. Its remote location surprised me, but the amenities impressed me. Felicia noted that the resort catered to wealthy UF alumni, and our ocean view suite showcased her PR skills. After unpacking, we enjoyed mojitos and discussed the resort's cost, with Felicia joking we'd need to build more to afford it. Later, while she had a spa massage, I swam laps. We napped and headed to dinner, but the Continental was full. We were about to head to the American Grill instead when a man at a nearby table waved us over. The man approached us. "I noticed you were having trouble finding a seat. I'm Don Cavendish, and this is my wife, Mia. If you're open to dining with strangers, we'd be happy to have you join us." I glanced at Felicia, and she nodded encouragingly, so I extended my hand to him. "Don, I'm Andy Salazar, and this is my wife, Felicia. We'd be delighted to join you." As we moved to their table, I took a moment to assess them. They made a striking couple. Don was an Anglo, about my height, perhaps a few years older than Felicia and me. Mia wasn't just a trophy wife. She was definitely an attractive woman with a captivating décolletage that drew attention to her impressive figure. To put it simply, she was quite well endowed and clearly confident about it. We started talking about ourselves and the resort. Don and Mia had just arrived from Ocala that day, so we shared some of our discoveries with them. The conversation soon covered a wide range of topics, and by the time the tiramisu arrived, I was surprised to realize how quickly the evening had passed. Don insisted on offering us a post-dinner drink, and after the glasses were served, he proposed a toast to making new friends in unexpected places. We all joined in the toast enthusiastically. When we were done, Don wasn't ready for the evening to end. "I hear there's a great nightclub here. How about we go for a dance or two?" I looked at Felicia, and she was smiling widely. "That sounds good, Don," I said, and we headed out. The nightclub was packed when we arrived, but Don must have worked some magic because a table for 4 suddenly appeared. After we ordered drinks, Don stood up and bowed to me. "Would it be all right if I asked your lovely wife for a dance?" he asked. "Only if I can dance with yours," I replied, and Mia gave me an approving nod. The band was playing classic rock, and soon all 4 of us were dancing to the music. After the first dance, we swapped partners and danced through a couple more songs before returning to our table to finish our drinks. I leaned over to Felicia. "Ready to head out?" I asked. "We have some unfinished business back at our room." When she agreed, we made our farewells and prepared to leave. Don and I exchanged a friendly hug, and then he hugged Felicia while I did the same with Mia. I thought Mia's hug was a bit more intimate than usual, but I didn't mind. Just as we were about to go, Don called out, "Hey, would you two like to join us for brunch tomorrow at 11 o'clock? We're staying in one of the beach cottages." He gave us the number. "And we'll be eating on the patio. Can you make it?" I looked at Felicia. She whispered, "I'm really enjoying Don and Mia, and I'd love to see one of those beach cottages." I turned back to Don and Mia. "If it's not too much trouble, we'd love to join you." With that settled, we went to the elevator to head back to our room. "What a nice surprise," Felicia said. "One moment we're with strangers, and the next we're dancing with new friends." "I felt the same way," I replied as I used my keycard to open the door. "What did you think of Mia?" "She seemed really nice," Felicia said while undressing. "But I didn't get to talk to her much." Then she turned to me with a playful smile. "But I know what you thought about her. You couldn't take your eyes off her chest." I tried to protest, but Felicia wasn't having it. "Well, I think it's time you gave a little attention to these," she said, gesturing to herself. "They may not be as big as Mia's, but I think they'll respond nicely if you give them a kiss." That was all the excuse I needed to sweep Felicia into my arms and enjoy a night of satisfying lovemaking. The next morning, we visited Don and Mia's cottage for an impressive brunch on their screened-in porch, with a pleasant breeze from the ceiling fans. Felicia and Mia decided to sunbathe by the infinity pool, while Don invited me for a deep-sea fishing trip on his 38-foot Chris-Craft cruiser. Although I had little deep-sea fishing experience, I was eager to join him. Don grabbed a chest of beer and ice, and I carried jerry cans of gasoline. A few miles out in the Gulf, we began trolling. Despite slow fishing, the beer and sea air made for a relaxing afternoon. Don's stories revealed his and Mia's considerable wealth. Then my rod bent sharply, and Don helped me reel in what seemed like a promising catch as he maneuvered the cruiser. Staying in the boat was tougher than I expected. Suddenly, Don pointed out a blue-white torpedo leaping from the water. It was a mako shark. I struggled to reel it in as it jumped repeatedly, but eventually it bit through the line and escaped. Don tried to comfort me about losing the shark, but I was relieved to avoid further confrontation with the fierce creature. Exhausted, I was ready to head back to the resort. Back in our room, I eagerly shared my adventure with Felicia, who reacted as hoped. However, I sensed she had something on her mind, and she took her chance as soon as I finished my story. "I had a bit of an adventure today, too," she said with an unreadable expression. When I looked at her curiously, she continued, "Mia and I had a very interesting chat by the pool. She mentioned that she and Don enjoy swinging." "I don't get it," I said, confused. "What do they like to swing?" Felicia looked at me as if I were naive. "No, Andy, they like to swap partners in bed." "Oh," I exclaimed as it sank in. "Wow, I wouldn't have guessed that." "But there's more," Felicia said with a sly smile. "Mia asked if we'd be interested in swinging with them tonight." I plopped down on the bed, overwhelmed. We had barely gotten to know these people, and now they were suggesting that? Mia was definitely attractive, but I had thought this weekend was supposed to be about reconnecting with Felicia. "I'm not sure, honey. I like them, but this feels a bit sudden." "What do you think?" Felicia sat down next to me. "I think we should go for it. We've talked about trying something like this for a while, and this is a great chance. We don't know these people well, and they live in a different city. It's not like we'll be seeing them often. Plus, Mia is pretty hot." Thinking about how Mia looked in her swimwear earlier made the idea seem quite tempting. Still, I wanted to be sure about how Felicia felt. "Are you sure, sweetheart? We're having a great weekend, and I'd be more than happy to focus entirely on you," I said, holding her hands. "Let's do it," she said, squeezing my hands for emphasis. "It'll be an adventure, something to add excitement and bring us closer. If it doesn't work out, we don't have to do it again." Her determination and my growing interest in Mia made me more open to the idea. Mia's closeness while dancing and her earlier comments became more intriguing. It was flattering that such an attractive woman was interested in me. I masked my excitement and agreed to the plan. At dinner with Don and Mia, the atmosphere was electric. Felicia wore a striking red dress, and Mia dazzled in black. Mia's fingers on my knee and the palpable tension suggested Don and Felicia were similarly engaged. An audible gasp from Mia confirmed it. After dinner, when the ladies wanted to dance, Don and I reluctantly agreed. The slow jazz turned our dance into foreplay, with Mia rubbing against me. Don and Felicia appeared to be enjoying themselves similarly. When the ladies went to the restroom, Don gave me his card key and suggested we use their cottage for the night while he and Felicia stayed in ours. We agreed, and Mia and I headed to the beach cottage. Once inside, Mia became intense, eagerly undressing me as we moved to the bedroom. After I had somewhat recovered, I realized that she had crawled up on the bed and was lying beside me. I took her in my arms and kissed her. "That was undoubtedly the best blowjob I ever had in my life," I told her sincerely. Mia lay face down on the bed and slid a small pillow under her hips. "Okay, big boy," she said in a husky voice. "Come do my backside." Mia woke me up. She reminded me not to miss breakfast. Groggily, I got dressed, and as we headed to the main building, Mia linked her arm with mine and complimented me on the previous night. I felt uneasy about Felicia and wondered about her night and our relationship. Although the experience with Mia was fantastic, I needed to check in with my wife. At the restaurant, Felicia and Don were already seated. Felicia greeted me with a smile and mentioned she'd ordered breakfast for me. When I asked if everything was okay, she said it was fine and inquired about my night. I told her it was good and suggested we discuss it later. Felicia urged me to eat something first, noticing I looked worn out. As we ate, we discussed plans for the day. Mia wanted to take us out on the boat, but Don had a conference call and couldn't join. He encouraged us to go ahead, assuring us that Mia was skilled at sailing. The perfect weather made the boat ride appealing, and spending time with two women in swimwear sounded great. Felicia and I headed to our room to change, but I felt increasingly sleepy. Felicia noticed my yawning and suggested I take a short nap while she and Mia went without me. I collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. Felicia kissed me on the cheek, left a do not disturb sign, and told me to rest well. I was jolted awake by loud knocking and shouting. Struggling to sit up, I saw it was nearly 4 p.m., surprised at how late it had gotten. The knocking continued as I stumbled to the door and found a worried hotel employee. He explained that they had been searching for me and that there had been an accident. Dragging me toward the elevator, he insisted I come immediately. Outside, a group of uniformed men awaited. A Coast Guard officer pointed to a helicopter hovering over smoke in the Gulf. Another officer showed me a live feed of burning wreckage drifting at sea, explaining there had been an explosion and fire. "What kind of boat was it?" I asked, my voice trembling with fear. "From what we can determine, it was a Chris-Craft hardtop cruiser," he said, and I felt my legs weaken. I swallowed hard and tried to phrase my next question carefully. "Are there any survivors? Have they managed to rescue anyone?" He looked at me with a sad expression. "The helicopter hasn't spotted any life vests, and the diver they deployed hasn't found any bodies in the water." Noticing my reaction, he added, "But a boat from the Marine Safety Office in Tampa will arrive shortly, and they'll conduct a more detailed search." The image of the Mako shark suddenly flashed in my mind. I shuddered and tried to push the thought away. "What could have caused that?" I asked, pointing at the feed from the helicopter. "It looks like a bomb went off." The officer shook his head. "We often see this, engine fumes causing explosions when someone tries to restart the engine. We lose a lot of boaters this way." He then answered his radio and told me their cruiser was continuing the search. "There's nothing more you can do right now. Why don't you go back to your room so we can find you if there's news?" Reluctantly, I headed back inside, overhearing someone say, "Poor bastard," which only deepened my despair. If the professionals were pessimistic, what hope did I have? The afternoon dragged on without the call I was hoping for. I called my office, my sister and Felicia's parents, each call more painful than the last. Later, a waiter delivered food from the manager, but I had no appetite and barely nibbled. I spent the evening peering out at the dark Gulf, hoping for a rescue. Unable to sleep, I started packing our bags and found a pair of Felicia's underwear under the bed. The sight of them, crusty from last night's activities, brought a wave of shame. I had spent the last night of her life with another woman, and Mia, who might have perished as well. Resentment surged. If Mia hadn't worn me out, I might have been there to help Felicia. My thoughts turned to Don, and I realized he was likely enduring the same torment. I collapsed on the bed, overwhelmed by guilt, grief, anger, and despair. It was the worst night of my life. Lying there, memories of my life with Felicia flooded back. We met at Florida Atlantic University through soccer scholarships and quickly became close. We dated through college and married after graduation. Learning about Felicia's family deepened my understanding of her. Her parents were staunch anti-communists. Her father's family lost their sugar plantation in Cuba after Castro's revolution and fled to Miami. Her mother grew up in poverty, and both parents worked hard to put Felicia through college. Felicia was determined never to be poor, driven by her family's struggles. Despite the hardships, including the 2008 housing bust that nearly bankrupted my construction company, Felicia stood by me, supporting us emotionally and financially. I now feared I might never have the chance to fully express my love and gratitude. As dawn approached, I recited childhood prayers, hoping for a miracle. I must have fallen asleep because I was jolted awake by a knock on the door. A Coast Guard officer informed me that the search for survivors was being called off. Despite my protests, he explained that their equipment had been used throughout the night and that the chances of finding survivors were minimal. The severity of the explosion likely meant that neither of the passengers suffered. I wanted to scream. I wanted to force them to continue searching for my Felicia. I even wanted to die myself. But instead, I just stood there staring at the floor. Finally, I looked up at him and said, "Thank you, officer, for doing everything you could." He shook my hand, turned, and walked away with a somber demeanor. I closed the door and collapsed onto the floor. I'm not sure how long I had been lying there, but I was jolted awake by another knock on the door. When I answered, 2 uniformed men were standing outside. "Mr. Salazar?" one of them asked. When I nodded, he clarified, "Andres Salazar?" "Yes," I replied, "that's me. Who are you?" He took out his ID from his pocket. "We're from the Citrus County Sheriff's Department. We need to talk to you about the incident that occurred in the Gulf yesterday." "All right," I said with a sigh. "Come in." This wasn't what I wanted to deal with at the moment, but it seemed there had to be some official investigation. We sat down in the living area of the suite, and the deputy began, "Where were you when the incident happened?" I found the emphasis on incident strange and didn't like it, but I told him I had been in the room from breakfast until around 4 p.m. "That's 6 hours," he remarked. "What were you doing in your room all that time?" "I was napping," I replied, my irritation growing. "You must have really gone all out the night before," he said with a smirk. I just stared at him. "Did anyone see you while you were napping?" the deputy asked sarcastically. Keeping my composure, I answered, "Not that I know of. I was asleep the entire time. So, no one can confirm your whereabouts between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., is that correct, Senor Salazar?" he said, stretching out my name in a mocking tone. I jumped up abruptly. That condescending tone was all too familiar. Even though it had been a while, it still managed to strike a nerve. South Florida has a large Latino population, with nearly 60% of Dade County being Hispanic, and about half of those being foreign-born. However, as you move north, this percentage drops significantly, and you can still encounter some outdated prejudices, especially in rural areas. But that didn't mean I had to accept it. "What's going on here? My wife has just died in a tragic accident, and now you're treating me like I'm a criminal suspect," I said, my anger rising. "You're the one who mentioned crime, senor," the other deputy replied. That was the breaking point for me. "Officers, I'm aware of my rights, and I will not answer any more questions without my lawyer present," I said firmly. The two men exchanged glances. The first one shut his notebook. "I suppose you know how this appears, Senor Salazar." "It appears as though an American citizen is exercising his constitutional rights," I retorted. He shrugged, and both deputies headed toward the door. "Very well, we'll expect you and your lawyer at the Citrus County Sheriff's Office in Inverness tomorrow," he said before leaving. It took me a few minutes to compose myself. Then I grabbed the phone and called Jose Pascuo, my attorney in Orlando. When his secretary heard who was calling, she connected me immediately. "Andy," Jose said when he answered, "we were all stunned by the news. Please accept my deepest condolences for the loss of your wonderful wife. It doesn't take long for bad news to spread," I thought. "That's why I'm calling, Jose. I'm still at the Paradiso Resort, and I've just been questioned by two local deputies who seem to hold some prejudice, treating me as if I'm a suspect. I'm in unfamiliar territory here and need legal help immediately." Jose paused for a moment, and then said, "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, but just in case, we should get you someone local who's familiar with the courts up there. Let me make a few calls, and I'll get back to you." I thanked him and sank into a chair. My head was pounding, and this nightmare seemed to be getting worse by the minute. About an hour later, the phone rang, and I answered it eagerly. It was Jose. "I've got both good and bad news. Let's start with the bad. How well do you know Don and Mia Cavendish?" he asked. "We only met them this weekend," I replied. "Well, Mia Cavendish is actually Mia Reynolds. Her father is one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Marion County, owning the largest thoroughbred horse farm in Ocala. The issue is that none of the major law firms in Central Florida will take your case because they all owe favors to Mr. Reynolds," he explained. "Damn it," I said. "So what do I do now?" "The good news is that I've found a lawyer in Inverness who can represent you. Her name is Gina Ellerby. The bad news is that she's relatively young and inexperienced, but she comes highly recommended by several locals," he said. "I'm confident she'll be able to handle this for you." "All right," I said. "If you think she can handle the prejudices here, then I'm on board." "Great," he responded. "I've already reached out to her office. She'll meet you at the resort in the morning, and you two can head to Inverness together to meet with the sheriff's department. I'm sure you'll sort everything out with her help." He paused. "And Andy, once again, I'm truly sorry for your loss. If there's anything else I can do to help, just let me know." "Thank you, Jose," I said, struggling with my emotions. It seemed like any mention of it could set me off. The resort management called a bit later to let me know that I could stay another night if needed, and I thanked them for their kindness. After that, I contacted my office to get an update on the ongoing projects. Despite my grief, I knew I couldn't neglect my business responsibilities. Once I was caught up on work, I spent the rest of the afternoon painfully arranging a memorial service for Felicia. I felt it was something I owed to her friends, family, and to her memory. That evening, I endured another sleepless night, trying to come to terms with everything that had happened. After breakfast the next morning, I waited in my room for my new attorney to arrive. When I heard a somewhat hesitant knock on the door, I opened it to find a young, fresh-faced woman standing there. "Good morning, Mr. Salazar," she said, offering her hand. "I'm Gina Ellerby, your attorney." As she stepped into the room, I couldn't help but stare. Jose had mentioned she was young, but she looked like she could have just finished high school. She was attractive, but she reminded me of one of those young stars the Disney Channel seems to produce constantly. She noticed me staring and asked, "Is something wrong, Mr. Salazar?" Her voice was high-pitched and sounded quite youthful. "Excuse me," I said, "but could you tell me how old you are?" I knew it was a bit rude, but I couldn't restrain myself. Her face flushed and she straightened up, though it didn't make much difference. "I understand that I look younger than my age, and that my voice may sound childish, Mr. Salazar. But I'm 27 years old. I've graduated from law school, passed the bar exam, and I'm licensed to practice law in Florida. If that's not satisfactory, I can leave, and you can find another attorney," she said, clearly offended. I raised my hands, both to stop her from leaving and to apologize for my earlier behavior. "I'm sorry, Miss Ellerby. You caught me off guard. Let's start over. I'm Andres Salazar, but you can call me Andy. I'd like you to represent me." She took a deep breath and then offered her hand for a shake. "Apology accepted," she said. "I'd prefer to call you Andy, and you can call me Gina. I'm looking forward to working with you. Mr. Pasquo briefed me on your situation, but I'd like to hear the details from you." I started. "Felicia and I drove up here on Thursday." "Oh, Andy," she interrupted. "I'm so sorry about your wife. I meant to express my condolences when I first arrived." I nodded, appreciating her sympathy. At that moment, there wasn't much more to say except thank her for her concern. I then gave her a brief overview of the weekend's events, though I left out the details about our plans with Don and Mia on Saturday night. It just felt wrong to mention that in light of Felicia's memory. Gina took notes as I spoke, and after I finished, it was time to drive the 30 minutes to Inverness. Gina offered to drive, and as we headed east on FL 44, she mentioned that she didn't foresee any problems. "I've already reviewed the Coast Guard report online, and they've classified it as a boating accident. I suspect today's meeting is just a formality to wrap things up. You've just had the misfortune of dealing with some less than friendly individuals, but don't worry. They won't try anything with me around." I was beginning to feel more confident about having Gina as my attorney. She clearly knew her stuff, and I liked her attitude. When we arrived at the Inverness Sheriff's Department, Sheriff McGee himself wanted to speak with us. It quickly became clear that this wasn't going to be a routine meeting. He started by asking the same questions his deputies had about my whereabouts on the day of the accident. I felt uneasy admitting that I couldn't prove I'd been in the room the entire time. "You mentioned you were napping from around 10 o'clock in the morning until nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's quite a long nap. You must have been really worn out from the night before," the sheriff noted, raising his eyebrows. I shifted nervously in my seat. This was a topic I had hoped to avoid. "We had stayed out late dancing at the nightclub," I explained. He made a note in his pad. "Can you describe your relationship with your late wife, Mr. Salazar?" he asked, catching me off guard. "Good, Sheriff, very good," I responded quickly. "We had our disagreements like any couple, but we had a strong marriage." Gina shot me a disapproving look, and I realized my answer hadn't been well received. The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "So you were a devoted and happy husband?" he asked, and I quickly agreed. "Then why, Mr. Salazar, did resort staff see you leaving the nightclub with Mia Cavendish instead of your wife? And why did you and Mia go to her beach cottage and not return until the next morning?" As I hesitated, I noticed Gina's shocked expression out of the corner of my eye. I realized too late how suspicious my attempts to protect Felicia's reputation must have seemed. All I could do was come clean about the whole situation. "Sheriff, Felicia and I had talked about spicing up our relationship a bit, and when Don and Mia presented an opportunity, we decided to explore it," I said. I gave him a summary of our encounter, leaving out only the specifics of what Mia and I had done together. Once I finished, I added, "Please keep this confidential. It would be really distressing for Felicia's parents to find out about this, especially right now. I'm sure you understand." He didn't reply, but made another note. Then he shifted to a new topic. "Did you and Mrs. Salazar have any life insurance policies?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, we never got any. I've always thought they were a poor investment." "So you wouldn't benefit financially if your wife passed away unexpectedly?" "Absolutely not," I replied, my frustration growing. "Not even the accidental death and dismemberment policy provided by your wife's employer?" he pressed. "Oh," I said, suddenly realizing, "I forgot about that." As I spoke, I noticed Gina looking at me with concern. "Your wife increased the coverage on that policy to $1 million just last month," the sheriff continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "Felicia mentioned she was doing that, but I had no idea it was that much," I said quickly. I knew my response sounded weak. The sheriff changed the subject again. Let's revisit Mia Cavendish. How long had you known her? This weekend was the first time I met her, I answered promptly. Can you prove that, Mr. Salazar? He shot back. Before I could respond, Gina intervened. Sheriff, you know it's impossible to prove something didn't happen. The sheriff, clearly frustrated, began to reply. Now see here, young lady. But Gina's face flushed with anger and she stood up abruptly. The sheriff also got to his feet and Gina confronted him directly. Sheriff McGee, I am a licensed attorney and an officer of the court. You will either show me the respect I deserve or I'll have you facing disciplinary charges. As she spoke, the sheriff instinctively started to retreat from the furious young woman, but she advanced until he was cornered against the wall. Despite his imposing size of 250 pounds, the sheriff seemed to be intimidated by the petite woman who was likely half his weight. I believe my client has endured enough of your relentless questioning and unreasonable queries for today, she said firmly. Unless you plan to arrest him and charge him with something, we're leaving now. If you need to speak with him again, you know where to reach me. The sheriff gave me a shrewd look. No, you're free to go, Mr. Salazar. You can return to Orlando, but don't even think about leaving the state of Florida. With that, Gina turned, took hold of my arm, and almost pulled me out of the sheriff's office. Once we were back on the highway, I glanced at her and said, Wow. Remind me never to get on your bad side. The way you handled the sheriff. Listen, she interrupted sharply. I'm this close to dropping your case. Don't ever lie to me again about anything. I can't represent you properly if you do. Gina, I'm sorry, I said earnestly. I didn't mean to lie. I was just embarrassed about the wife swapping and didn't want to damage Felicia's reputation, or Maya's for that matter. I genuinely didn't know about Felicia increasing her insurance to $1 million. Please believe me. She stared ahead in silence for a moment. All right, she finally said. I believe you. But don't hide things from me again. Then she smiled slightly. Besides, wanting to experiment with your marriage doesn't make you a murderer. I still think this was a tragic accident. By then, we had arrived at the resort, and she pulled into the parking lot to let me out. I know you need to get back to Orlando. I'll handle things here, and if anything changes, I'll get in touch with you immediately. After I checked out of the resort and started driving back to Orlando, I couldn't help but think about the tough days ahead. The first thing I had to deal with was the memorial service, and I knew it would be an incredibly hard experience for me. 2 days later, while I was at the office, the phone rang. It was Jose. Have you seen the Sentinel? He asked. When I told him I hadn't, he said, you should check out the local section, but be warned, it's not going to be pleasant. It seems like someone's really gone after you. I thanked Jose for the heads up and checked the online edition. Clicking on local breaking news, the first headline I saw was, Orlando man named person of interest in wife's death. The article not only detailed the explosion, but also included many points the sheriff had mentioned during our meeting. Terms like unexplained absence, possible motive, and bed games were all over the place. I was furious. In my anger, I called Gina and gave her a piece of my mind. The sheriff must have leaked all this to the newspaper to put pressure on me. How could he do that? I demanded. And the story is full of insinuations and guesses. It reads like tabloid trash, not a legitimate news source. Moreover, I continued, if the sheriff thinks the explosion wasn't an accident, why isn't Don Cavendish under suspicion? He had more to gain from this than I did. Forget about Cavendish, Gina replied. He's not a suspect. The sheriff told me he has a solid alibi with 6 witnesses. He was on a lengthy conference call the entire time, Gina explained, and the participants confirmed that Don was involved throughout. I wasn't convinced. That doesn't prove much. Cavendish could have used a cell phone. He could have been anywhere. Gina let out a deep breath. But he wasn't, Andy. The building where he was on the call has security cameras in the hallways. The footage shows Don entering the building before the call started and not leaving until after it ended. And just so you know, the windows in that building are fixed. Hearing my frustrated grunt, Gina continued. Andy, I genuinely believe this was a tragic accident. I think the sheriff is investigating thoroughly. Or maybe he's just been watching too many detective shows. Either way, I'm confident this will all be wrapped up soon, and you'll be cleared. Maybe, I muttered, but in the meantime, I'm being portrayed as a wife killer. For the next few days, there were no new updates in the news, but I dreaded the upcoming memorial service even more. I would have to confront my grief and loss while also dealing with the rumors and suspicions. I wanted to avoid it, but doing so would only make things worse. Besides, I told myself I owed it to Felicia. The service turned out to be as painful as I had expected. The priest's sermon offered little comfort, and the eulogies were agonizing. When it was my turn to speak, I broke down halfway through my prepared remarks and had to cut it short. As I tried to recall some of our happier moments, I choked up and could only manage to say, "I miss you, Felicia," before stepping away from the pulpit. Despite a decent turnout for the service, I noticed that far fewer people came through the reception line afterward. Instead, many guests gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves. I could only guess what they were discussing. At one point, I noticed Felicia's family standing off to the side. Her father gave me a piercing look, and I wished I could say something to assure him that I hadn't harmed his beloved daughter. Then her mother hurried over and gave me a quick hug. "We know you loved her, Andres. Once all this is over, you should come visit us." That made me feel a bit better, but I couldn't help wondering how long it would take for all this to blow over. The only other thing that stood out to me about the service was that my entire football team showed up, which meant a lot to me. The last one to come through the line was Domingo, our striker. Small but as quick as lightning, he came up and gave me a big hug. "Hey Andres, stay strong, man. We all know you didn't do anything wrong." He flashed a wide smile. "You're like a Boy Scout. In all the games we've played, you never even got a red card." I couldn't help but smile as I thanked him. I only wished that others shared the same confidence in me. A week after the memorial service, I was working in my office when Gina Ellerby walked in. "Gina, what are you doing here?" I asked in surprise. "I had some updates for you, and since work's been slow, I thought I'd come by in person if you're not too busy." "No, not at all," I replied. "I'm glad you're here. I didn't mean to put you out. And what have you found?" She told me she'd gone to the sheriff to find out how the reporter had gotten information about the investigation. I asked if he'd taken a side job with the Sentinel, she said, but he denied any involvement. However, he did admit to recording the interview, so someone else could have heard it, she added. I suspected one of the two deputies was likely responsible. I didn't like it, but there wasn't much I could do. The information was out, and all I could do was hope my name would be cleared soon. But when Gina showed up at my office a week later, my hopes for a quick resolution were dashed. "The sheriff told me they found new evidence," she said, and her expression made it clear that it wasn't good news. "The jerry cans from the Chris Craft have washed up on shore," she said, "and they have your fingerprints all over them." I shook my head in frustration. "Of course my fingerprints are on the cans. That doesn't mean much," I told her. "When Don and I were getting the boat ready for fishing on Friday, I brought the extra fuel for him. Naturally, my prints would be on those cans." She nodded in understanding. "I trust you, Andy. It's just that it doesn't look great. If I were a prosecutor presenting to a jury, I'd outline 3 things needed to prove a crime: motive, means, and opportunity. Felicia's life insurance gives a clear motive. Your fingerprints on those cans suggest you had the means, and your lack of an alibi for those 6 hours on the day in question points to an opportunity. But I've already explained each of those points," I argued. "I know," she said, "and that's likely why no charges have been filed yet. But I've seen cases where juries have convicted based on evidence that was even less substantial than this." I looked at her feeling worried and frustrated. "This is turning into a nightmare. What will it take to show people I'm innocent?" She paused to think. "The biggest issue is proving where you were on Sunday. The resort manager told me the sheriff's team interviewed all the staff to see if anyone saw you, but they found nothing." "That's because I was asleep in my room," I exclaimed. "But no one knows that. I'm left having to prove something that can't be proven." Gina began to walk around the room. "There must be a way to show that you never left your room." After a moment, she asked, "Aren't all the doors at the resort controlled by card keys? Wouldn't they have a record of every time someone entered a room?" "No," I said. "Card keys don't work that way. Each door lock is a standalone unit programmed to accept only a specific code on the card. The code is valid only for that particular door and only during the guest's stay. The locks aren't connected to a central system. To change the codes, you need a special device." An idea suddenly struck me, making me gulp. "But I recently read about some new systems that communicate with a central computer, allowing hotels to track all entries and exits. Since the Paradiso is a brand new top-tier resort, could it possibly have a system like that?" It was a slim chance, but it was all I had. I quickly grabbed the phone and called the resort. The manager remembered me, and as I explained my question, he began to see why I was so hopeful. "The Paradiso is cutting edge in every way," he said, "including our card key system." "Why didn't you mention this earlier?" I asked, frustrated. "Honestly, I've never worked at a hotel with such a system before. With the preview and the official opening, I've been so busy that I hadn't considered it, but it should be operational. Let me check. A few minutes later, he was back on the line. You might be in luck, Mr. Salazar. The system is functioning, and we have data from the preview weekend on the server. Please keep those records safe, I pleaded. We'll come up to review them as soon as possible. Gina and I drove to Crystal River as quickly as we could. If there had been any Florida State Police around, we likely would have been pulled over. Fortunately, they must have been occupied with tourist traffic, so we arrived without any issues. When we arrived at the resort, the manager was waiting for us. He guided us to the area with the computer system and handed us a stack of printouts he had prepared. Gina and I looked at them, but neither of us could make sense of the data. Each page corresponds to a different date, the manager explained. Here, he said, pointing to a column heading, are all the times. The room numbers are listed on the horizontal axis. The codes in the table show the status, whether the door was open or closed, and if a card key was used. Gina looked puzzled. How can a door be opened without a card key? When it's opened from the inside, he clarified. He flipped through several pages and pointed to a set of lines. This is the record for the room Mr. Salazar stayed in during our preview weekend. You can see all the entries and exits for each day. And here, he said, turning to another page, is the record for that Sunday. As you can see, the door was opened without a card key just before 8:30 a.m., likely when you and your wife went down for breakfast. I glanced at Gina, hoping she wouldn't mention Don Cavendish being in the room at that time. Here, he continued, you can see that the door was opened with the card key at 9:57 a.m., which was probably when you returned from breakfast. About 30 minutes later, the door opened without the card key again, likely when your wife left the room. After that, the door remained closed until 3:56 p.m. I turned to Gina. But this doesn't really prove anything, I said. I could have left with Felicia at 10:30. But Gina was practically bouncing with excitement. If you had left then, how could you have gotten back into the room when the bellman found you there at 4 o'clock? Don't you see? This shows you were in the room the whole time. It confirms you were honest about your whereabouts on Sunday. My eyes widened, and I hugged her. You're brilliant, Gina, I said. Then I turned to the manager. Can we keep these records? I asked, and he told me he had printed them out just for us. With the printout in hand, we rushed to the sheriff's office in Inverness. Sheriff McGee was leaving as we arrived. Gina waved the printout, shouting, Sheriff, we have the proof! She laid the papers on his car hood and explained they showed Andy was in his room the whole time, proving the explosion was an accident. The sheriff examined the printouts and said he'd review them further and speak to the resort manager. He grudgingly acknowledged Gina's work, then drove off. Gina was thrilled and hugged me. I think we've done it, she said. I offered to take her to dinner as a celebration, and she chose the McLeod House Bistro, a charming, century-old restaurant in Inverness. Over dinner, I learned more about Gina. She graduated from a modest Florida law school and passed the bar on her second attempt. Struggling initially, she eventually got legal work for the new resort near Crystal River, and I was her first criminal case. Gina's personal life was unremarkable. She mentioned a boyfriend she hadn't seen in a while and kept her social circle small, leading a solitary life in Citrus County. Despite her less impressive legal skills and youthful appearance, her determination and persistence had uncovered crucial evidence to help me. After dinner, I planned to return to Orlando, but Gina invited me for coffee at her place. During a quick tour which led to her bedroom, I noticed a teddy bear on her bed. As I turned to leave, Gina stopped me and asked me to fire her. Shocked, I questioned why. She explained it would breach legal ethics, then kissed me passionately. Although tempted, I hesitated, asking about her boyfriend. Gina reassured me, saying she really wanted this. After our breathing steadied, I expressed concern about protection. She reassured me she was on the pill, and we were likely safe. We shared a kiss and soon fell asleep. Later, she shyly asked if we could repeat the experience, preferring a slower pace. I complied, but her urgent needs soon had her moving wildly against me. At breakfast, Gina was cheerful, even dancing a bit. I was relieved she seemed guilt-free about our night together. She asked how it felt to be cleared of suspicion, but I was still troubled by the possibility of a crime. Sheriff McGee had been so certain, and I wondered if there was more to it. Despite Gina's reassurance that it was just a tragic accident, I remained concerned. Don Cavendish had a lot to gain from his wife's death, and his alibi seemed too perfect. Gina thought I was being paranoid, but agreed to drive me to Don's office. The building was a plain two-story structure with a front and rear entrance, connected by a long hallway. There were no other exits. We entered the building and saw that Don Cavendish and Assisi had a suite at the rear. A security guard offered to show us an unleased office. Once inside the office, which was plain, I examined a floor-to-ceiling window and recognized the manufacturer from a decal. I asked Gina for nail clippers and used them to open a small slot in the window frame. The window pivoted open, surprising Gina. I realized the window was a center pivot design, allowing both sides to be cleaned and enabling someone to slip out without using the hallway. After closing and relocking it, I took Gina's arm and headed to find the sheriff. Gina stopped me, warning that without evidence, accusing Don Cavendish of involvement would be futile. She pointed out that the sheriff didn't arrest me due to weak evidence and likely wouldn't arrest Cavendish on even weaker grounds. She urged me to let it go, stressing that pursuing this could make me look worse. Though I recognized her point, I felt I needed to speak with Cavendish. Gina informed me that Cavendish had left town indefinitely. I was frustrated, believing he was hiding something. Gina suggested I return to Orlando, focus on my life, and accept the accident for my own peace of mind. She expressed her concern for me and hoped I wouldn't be consumed by conspiracy theories. As I drove back to Orlando, I couldn't shake the feeling that too many coincidences pointed to something more than an accident. Cavendish's conference call, the gasoline cans, and Mia's actions seemed too conveniently aligned. Yet, I wondered if I was overthinking it and if I should just move on. I threw myself into work, hoping to distract myself. Despite the busy week, I found myself still obsessing over the details. On Thursday afternoon, I was surprised to see Gina in my office, dressed nicely and holding a bottle of champagne. She was there to celebrate the sheriff's closure of the investigation, officially ruling the explosion an accident. I thanked her and asked why she was really there. Gina, no longer smiling, explained that although she wasn't in love with me, we shared common experiences, loneliness, loss, and desire. She suggested we help each other out for a night. Recognizing the truth in her words and feeling the same way, I invited her to dinner at my place. Her smile in response made me glad I'd extended the offer. After we finished in bed, Gina became serious and revealed she might know where Don Cavendish was. She had seen a package with his name at the resort office addressed to Lake Tahoe and had written it down. Additionally, she learned that Don's business invested heavily in the Paradiso. I began dressing, determined to go to Tahoe to find Cavendish and uncover the truth. Gina wanted to come along, but I insisted she stay behind for her safety. She left reluctantly, and I notified my office of my absence before booking a flight to Reno. Upon arrival at Reno Tahoe International, I faced an unexpected challenge: an early snowstorm. As a lifelong Floridian, dealing with snow was new to me, but I was determined to push through. I rented a four-wheel drive vehicle and chains at the airport, then spent the evening in Reno, opting to drive to Lake Tahoe the next morning. After a smooth drive on I-580 and Nevada 431, I put chains on the tires as snow thickened near Galena Creek Park. The drive up Mount Rose Highway was challenging with heavy snow and sharp turns, but I made it safely to South Lake Tahoe by early afternoon. Exhausted after the 3-hour drive, I checked into the Mont Bleu Casino Hotel. After resting, I used my rental SUV to locate Cavendish's address. The GPS took me to a large Swiss-style chalet with a stunning lake view, but as night fell and snow continued, I decided to return to the hotel. I relaxed with a burger and beer at the Zone while watching the Miami game, which lifted my spirits. After the game, I explored the casino and spotted Don Cavendish at a blackjack table, clearly doing well. With a tall, attractive blonde at his side, he seemed to be enjoying himself. Not wanting to confront him, I decided to wait until the next day. Back in my room, I struggled to sleep, troubled by seeing Cavendish and the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, I prepared for the encounter, wearing skiing and climbing gear I had bought in Reno for warmth. I also acquired a firearm from a local gun dealer, paying extra to bypass the waiting period. Checking out of the hotel, I noticed the heavy snowfall and grew more somber. I drove carefully back up to Cavendish's chalet, parking out of sight. Seeing smoke from his chimney, I was reassured that he was likely still there. The hike up the hill to Cavendish's house was tough in the snow. Panting, I crouched behind some trees and assessed the security system, using my construction knowledge to bypass it with a pry bar and screwdriver. I then entered through a window into an unoccupied guest bedroom, the carpet muffling my footsteps. I moved down the hallway towards the light. As I approached the end of the carpeted hallway, I saw Cavendish sitting at the dining room table, reviewing some papers. But as soon as I stepped into the great room, the floorboard creaked and his head snapped up. He jumped to his feet, but I aimed the tool at him and ordered him to stay put. When I got close enough for him to see me clearly, his expression turned into a smirk. "Well, well, Andy Salazar. I didn't expect to see you here. Give it up, Cavendish," I snapped at him. "I know you were behind the boat explosion, and I know exactly how you did it." He just stared at me, so I continued, trying to unsettle him. "The conference call was a piece of cake. With a cell phone, you could have made that call from anywhere, and your colleagues wouldn't have known. Figuring out how you manipulated the video from the office building took a bit more work, but once I visited the place and saw those center pivot windows, it was clear. Not many people realize how easy they are to open if you know the trick." I noticed a flicker of unease in his eyes and thought I might be getting through to him. Getting to the yacht must have been a breeze. You probably had a motorboat waiting. "No," he said with arrogance. "It was a ski-doo, faster and easier to hide, and with a wetsuit on, no one recognized me." "But why go through all this? You were already wealthy. How much is enough?" His face darkened with anger. "That's where you're mistaken, Salazar. All the money was in Mia's name. She demanded a prenup when we married, and she used it to keep me under control. I wanted her dead almost as much as I wanted her money." Then his smile returned, even wider than before. And of course, the money wasn't the only thing I wanted. At that moment, I felt a barrel pressed against my neck. "You'll have a longer life if you put that on the floor," a voice whispered behind me. Despair washed over me as I bent down and placed my tool on the floor. "Kick it away," came the command, and I used my foot to push it away from Cavendish. At least he wouldn't be able to reach it easily. The gunman stepped back from me and started pacing around the room, eventually ending up next to Cavendish. When I saw the long blonde hair, I cursed my own foolishness. "Damn it! I never considered she might still be around." Cavendish was grinning widely. "You still don't get it, do you, Andy?" He nudged the blonde, who then touched her hair and began adjusting it. After a moment, she grabbed the golden locks and pulled them off her head, revealing short black pixie-cut hair. "Oh my God! Felicia!" I exclaimed, nearly collapsing in shock. She looked at Cavendish with a satisfied smile. "See, Don, I told you the disguise worked." I was stunned. "You were in on this the whole time?" I asked, barely able to believe it. She gave me a smug look. "Who do you think put a double dose of Ambien in your breakfast on Sunday? Who do you think increased her life insurance to give you a motive? Who do you think added more Ambien to the drink I made for that troublemaker Mia so she wouldn't cause problems when Don came to the boat?" Cavendish was now bragging. "It was so simple. By the time I reached the yacht, Mia was out cold, so it was easy to weigh her down and throw her overboard. Then I rigged the engine and Felicia and I made our escape. I dropped her off at a cove where we had a car waiting, then returned to Crystal River and slipped back into the building unnoticed. The explosion covered up the missing women, and the evidence against you deflected suspicion from me." Trying to process their words, I stammered. "So all of this must have been planned." "Oh yes, my dear husband," Felicia cut in. "We fell in love shortly after I started managing PR for the Paradiso. When Don told me about his issue with Mia, we started looking for ways to deal with her. We decided that a sea accident was the perfect way to eliminate her and let me disappear at the same time," she said with a smirk. "And the sneak preview was my idea. It was a great way to get you to the resort where we could execute our plan." I was in shock. "But why, Felicia? Why would you do this? I thought we were happy together. You were so affectionate at the resort. How could you betray me like this?" Her face turned red and her eyes became wild. With an almost frenzied tone, she yelled, "You know why? I told you before, I will never be poor again." I stumbled back, overwhelmed by her intensity. I hadn't realized how deeply her troubled childhood had affected her. Felicia seemed to regain her composure and moved closer to Cavendish, wrapping her arm around him. In a calmer tone, she continued, "Now that Mia is out of the picture and everyone believes I'm dead, we'll never have to worry about money again. I love him, and we can be together forever." "No!" a voice cried from the hallway, and I turned in surprise to see Gina standing there. Her pink snowsuit made her look very young, but the tool she was holding was unmistakably real. Felicia's gun swung uncertainly between me and Gina, as if she couldn't decide which of us posed a greater threat. Tears were streaming down Gina's face. "It's not true!" she shouted at Felicia. "Don loves me! He promised he was going to leave Mia so we could be together." I stared at her in disbelief. "Don was your boyfriend?" But Gina's focus was entirely on Cavendish. "You told me you loved me. You promised." Cavendish's smirk returned. "Did I say I loved you, Gina? I'm afraid I was just being charming." "But you pursued me, made promises," Gina protested, now crying. "Oh dear, by now you should know that men will say anything to seduce a young woman. While I enjoyed our brief affair, what I really wanted was your legal skills, or rather, your lack of them. I kept you busy with legal work for the Paradiso so you'd be available to represent Andy once I made sure no other lawyer would. I figured that after the way you messed up the Paradiso case, you'd end up convicting our friend here on flimsy evidence. But you couldn't even manage that, could you? No, you're just a naive, immature little girl. Gina's distress quickly turned into fury, and she shouted, "Don't call me a little girl!" It seemed she must have accidentally pulled the trigger, as a loud gunshot rang out, and a burst of red appeared in the middle of Don Cavendish's chest. He touched the blood in shock, then fell to his knees and collapsed face first onto the ground. Felicia screamed and fired a shot that struck Gina in the shoulder, spinning her around. The second bullet hit Gina in the back, causing her to fall to the ground. I doubted she'd be able to get up after that. Felicia knelt beside Don, sobbing and shaking him. Seeing this as my only opportunity, I began to run towards her. Felicia must have heard me coming because she stood up, turned, and fired at me. However, I was already sliding toward her, performing a soccer-style tackle. As I slid into her, my heavy boots kicked the side of her knee. Her face registered shock as she was thrown into the air, landing hard on her shoulder, with her head hitting the floor so forcefully that it stunned her. I quickly got to my feet and kicked the tool away from her. As she started to regain her composure, the pain from her injured knee must have hit her, causing her to cry out in pain and grab her leg. The awkward angle at which her knee was bent suggested she likely had a serious injury, possibly a torn ACL. She wasn't going to be walking on that leg anytime soon. I hurried over to Gina to check if I could assist, but finding no pulse at her neck or wrist, I let her lifeless body fall back to the floor. I thought to myself, poor Gina, what a terrible loss. I then approached Felicia and looked down at her. Through her tears, she reached up and grabbed at my pants leg. "Help me, Andy," she pleaded. "Help me, darling." I pulled my pants away from her grasp and dialed 911, giving the address and requesting both police and an ambulance for a double homicide. I promised the operator I'd be there to let them in. I sat by the window, watching the wet snow gently fall over the lake. The view was serene, but I missed the sand and ocean. I took out the miniature audio recorder from Reno and confirmed it had captured everything. I placed it on the table for the police. Felicia's crying caught my attention. If this were one of our league games, we'd have iced her knee to reduce swelling, but I decided to leave that to the professionals.